Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, everyone, to Espacio Fundación Telefónica. My name is Silvia Royo. I'm the coordinator of this program on the side of Fundación Telefónica, and I'm with Guillermo, who is in charge of the the Aspen Insitute. We wanted to welcome you to this new edition. We've been holding this cycle of sessions and debates since 2017. We invite relevant figures to talk about the way technology is influencing our lives, and we try to find a critical viewpoint. To start today, this cycle of sessions, we have Michael Ignatieff and Noelia Amoedo. And I want to thank the initiative Dare to Think from Penguin Random House team. We have several representatives from this publishing house. They're always trying to find synergies with us in order to promote this type of events where we try to find a critical viewpoint on whatever is going on in society nowadays. We have held about 70 debates and meetings within these cycles, and I invite you all to visit our websites where you can find all the relevant information accessible to everyone and free of charge. And I will leave now the floor to Santiago.
Gracias, Silvia.
Thank you, Silvia. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming along. For us, it's a very special program. We've been collaborating with Fundación Telefónica for 7 years. It's a great pleasure to collaborate with Pablo, Silvia, and Laura. I'm saying that it's very special because we think that it has a lot to do with the origin of Aspen in the US. As many of you know, it was born in 1950 with the idea of bringing together different profiles in order to think of what kind of society we want, and because they shared a concern, the leaders shared a concern about how technology development were at a pace, but the dimension about the ethical consequences was totally different. So the need to have different spaces to take a step back to reflect on these things is why they created Aspen. And we think that this program drinks from the same spirit and soul and that mission, and this is why we're very proud of it. And we're very proud that Michael Ignatieff is presenting this first session of the program here this year, as you all know, because you're here. Michael is a writer, he's been a politician, and he has been a dean and president of the Central European University. He has been a dean of the Harvard University. He has taught at Cambridge and Oxford. He has published the biography of Isaiah Berlin and the book Fire and Ashes that we commonly use in our program with the young politicians. He has just published this program that I encourage you to read it. It is going to be moderated by Noelia Amoedo. Fellow is a CEO in Mediasmart. She has been working in the tech sector since year 2000. I want to have an interesting conversation between two different profiles, so we hope that you enjoy it as much as you. Thanks to Fundación Telefónica, thanks to Penguin once again for helping us bring such great speakers, and the floor is all theirs. Thank you.
Good evening. I've just been listening to this beautiful language of yours. I didn't understand a word, but it's such a beautiful language. And now I'm going to torture you in this terrible language of English. It's an imperial language. You know, we expect everybody in the world to speak it. But please forgive me that I can't speak to you in your native tongue. It's an honor to be here. I'm very happy to be here. I'm here with quality control, by the way, namely my wife. Quality control ensures that if I talk too much, she goes like this, and I have to stop. So you have quality control and nothing too bad can happen. And I'm anxious to talk with Noelia, and also to talk to you, to engage with you. I published a number of books in Spain thanks to the fact that I have a wonderful publisher who's here tonight, and I want to thank her particularly for supporting me for so many years. I have not made her rich, and so her devotion to me is much appreciated. Let me tell you a little bit about this book. It's about consolation. And consolation, I don't know how it is in Spanish, but in English, consolation is a word that has almost dropped out of the language. It's not a word we use very much. But it is an essential experience of human life. It is a test of our solidarity with each other. And all of you, I'm sure, have been through a moment when you were with a friend who's just lost a brother or a sister or a father or a husband or a wife, and you have to find words that will give them some comfort and help. And as everybody knows who's been in that situation, words fail us. It's a very painful moment. And it's a test of whether we can share and relieve the suffering of others. And that's why the subject interests me. Can we relieve the suffering of others? And can we find meaning for our own suffering? Can we console ourselves, and can we console others? We can comfort each other. In English, if I want to comfort someone, I don't have to say anything. I can just put my arm around you. Or I can hand you a beer if you're a guy, and we can sit and watch television together, since men don't talk very well with each other. And somehow after time together, there is a feeling of comfort, and sometimes that can reduce the pain of an experience. But consolation is different. Consolation is giving some meaning to suffering, some meaning to failure, some meaning to loss. 2,000 years ago, we had plenty of words for that. If you were a Christian, you believed in salvation. You believed in forgiveness. The priest might give you forgiveness. Much of what we suffer from today is the sense we cannot be forgiven for what we have done, and therefore cannot be consoled. And many of us, your great-grandparents, and perhaps people in the room even now tonight, believed in paradise. That when someone you loved died, you would see them again in paradise. And these were the most consoling stories we ever told. But for many of us now, they're not available. And so this is a book that tries to talk about those ancient stories, those ancient good stories, which I hope I treat with great respect, and the transition that we went through as we began not to believe those stories, the Christian stories, the religious stories anymore, and how we have tried to find new stories to give meaning and to give hope to our passage through historical time. Some of the most influential of the modern stories are stories of progress. I tell a story about a famous Enlightenment mathematician, the Marquis de Condorcet. The Marquis de Condorcet supported the French Revolution, and by 1792 was being chased by the Jacobins and forced into hiding in fear of his life. And in that confinement, in a little apartment behind the Saint-Sulpice in Paris, he wrote a sketch on the progress of the human mind. And it's the most powerful account of progress written in the 18th century. It says that science and technology and knowledge will conquer ignorance and superstition and fear. Medical science will extend human life. Knowledge will conquer the differences and antagonisms between people, and we will live in peace, prosperity, and good health. And I won't get there, Condorcet says, but you will. He writes this book facing execution, then escapes from his hiding place and is caught by the Jacobins and dies. What he leaves behind is this sketch of progress. This sketch consoled him in confinement. It consoled him for fear and loss and fear of death. And I think in the 20th century and in the 21st century, the idea of progress has become the most consoling narrative we have. We have a war in Europe. We have social division. We have partisanship and stupidity in our politics, not just in Spain, everywhere. We have a climate crisis, which means that a couple of weeks ago, the farmers in southern Spain wondered and worried about the future of their beautiful olive trees. And so the whole of Europe worried about your olive trees for a couple of weeks, and we still worry about them. And we're so worried about these phenomenon that 2 weeks ago I was in a conference in Oxford, and a wonderful young woman got up, and we were talking about climate change, and she said, "I'm not going to have children. I'm not going to have children because I don't want to bring children into this world, and I think we shouldn't bring children into this world until we can promise them the hope that we had, and I can't." So that's where we are. We've generated, as a substitute for the religious languages of consolation, secular languages of consolation around the idea of progress of science and knowledge. And now we have young people whose anguish and good faith I do not question, who have so little hope in the future that they wonder whether they should have children. And I want to just leave us there, because I hope in the course of the next hour we will figure out what stories of hope can give us a sense of a future that we can believe in. For myself, I don't believe that young woman, for myself, because I'm the son of a woman who went through the Second World War and came back, and in the ruins of Europe gave birth to 2 children. And so I remember that there were women after the end of the Second World War who'd known devastation, loss, death, rape, terrible experiences, and then went out and gave birth to my generation. So I guess my answer to that young woman would be, the way to have hope in the future is to have faith in the past. And so I have faith in my parents' generation. And that gives me faith in the future. And so if you ask me what consoles me, and does console me, it's the experience of the people who made my life possible. I'll stop there. Thank you.
wanted to continue to hear you speak. I'm like, oh. Hello. Good afternoon, evening, I guess. Thank you very much for coming. Thanks to those who are listening on streaming. Let me start by thanking Telefónica and Aspen Insitute, Spain, for once again giving us all this space to reflect on how technological evolution is impacting so many areas of our life in impacting us as humans, and I guess thinking about what we can do to ensure that technological evolution is aligned with our values and our humanity. Thank you very much. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to have this conversation with Mr. Ignatieff. Michael is a man of who has lived many lives, from Harvard professor to a Canadian leader in the opposition, an author, a scholar, and a pretty heavyweight politician, and a man who has never been afraid of igniting a fiery debate. What do you think about that? Because that was written by ChatGPT when I said, I have to interview Michael. No, I'm not kidding. Just ChatGPT? Yes.
I'm revising my view of ChatGPT completely.
And this just required one prompt.
Yes.
Yeah. So I did say you have to be witty somehow, so I guess it was an okay prompt. But we'll talk more about what impact that has in us as humans and as society. Would like to talk a little bit more about your book and about you as a historian, because when I was reading your book, I felt like I feel many ways in Aspen Insitute, actually, when we're in seminars or other gatherings in which we use texts that were written a long time ago, often go back to ancient times, and we use them to spark conversation about challenges or opportunities in the current times. And I'm always surprised by how recent all the dilemmas they expose feel, right? But at the same time, I feel and read that all the problems we have today are not the same, right? Because the planet was never hotter, before we were not ever able to communicate with anybody in the world in an instant, and, nobody has ever been in this situation, right? So in your book, you actually know is when I need to choose between quotes and my glasses. You say none of these challenges, as daunting as they are made easier to overcome by believing they are unprecedented. So as a historian, what references, what precedents can you give us, if any?
A historian will always tell you there's nothing new under the sun. And it's a kind of form of professional stupidity. Climate change, just to take that example, we've had many experiences historically of catastrophic climate change. If you go to museums, you see those wonderful Dutch paintings of people skating on rivers in the 16th century. That's when the Great Freeze. So a terrible experience of a cyclical climate experience, which meant a lot of people starved because the crops were destroyed by cold. So it's not as if this is the first time human beings have faced radical climatic change. What is new is a couple of things that come together, one that's very good news and one that's difficult. One of them is that we know more about the climate than any generation in history. And when I think back to being a young graduate student at Harvard in 1970 and seeing the first poster of what the planet looks like from outside, from that famous exterior photograph of the planet, which I can't look at without being moved, we knew nothing about climate science then. The word ecosphere didn't exist. the very idea of iatrogenic, human-caused climate change was a novel idea. Fast forward to 2023, there's been a global revolution in our consciousness of climate. So a historian would say the thing we mustn't forget is how far we've come since 1970. That perspective means that a politician can get up now, a leader can get up, a business leader like you can get up and talk about this, and everybody in the room knows what you're talking about. 50 years ago, you had been talking in a void. Where that general knowledge is diffused, political change will follow. That's, I guess, my story. It's not going to happen fast enough. And there will be people in the audience right now who will say it's definitely not fast enough. But in a historical perspective, the global transformation of our understanding of the climate science and the global diffusion of that in the general population is a revolution. And if you ask me why I'm optimistic, I'm optimistic at the sheer speed with which our understanding of this has changed over the last 50 years. And how it's come into our politics. When I was in politics, it was suddenly there in a way that I, as a political leader, had to deal with. So that kind of stuff, we need more history because it helps us to calm down. We're setting our hair on fire all the time. Do you know what I mean? When we lose faith in ourselves as a result, and a young girl gets up in a serious conference and says she doesn't want to have children because she's so frightened about the future, and you want to kind of put your arm around her and say, I understand, I respect your feelings, I know how deeply this is affecting you, but for heaven's sake, for heaven's sake,
And we need to calm down, and we do have a lot of information, but I don't feel often we are necessarily as informed, because how do you deal with all this information coming at you so fast when you find, the time to calm down?
Well, that's another problem. We have, every one of you has a cell phone, I would imagine. And in that cell phone, each of you has the equivalent of the Library of Alexandria in your pocket. It's completely unprecedented in history. It's just
no precedent then.
That is no precedent. The diffusion of this kind of knowledge is completely revolutionary. We are in the middle of a complete destabilization of our politics, because the politics I grew up in was a patrician politics. A male-dominated, let me tell you what the truth is politics. A pre-Reformation politics in which only the Pope ruled. Mm-hmm. And we've now had the 20th century experience of the Gutenberg Revolution. And it has empowered every one of you in a way that's historically unprecedented, to challenge business leaders, to challenge university leaders, to challenge political leaders. And then we've had the new technology of the digital media, which is then diffusing something else, which is a tidal wave of garbage and fake news. And so each of us now both has the Library of Alexandria in our pockets, and a chaotic information space in which each of us is forced to make constant decisions of a basic epistemological kind, like, is this fact true? Is this true? Is this false? This is now the chief question in politics. And so this is new, it seems to me. The analogy is to the Protestant Reformation. The analogy is to the breakup of the unity of Christendom and the emergence of two competing versions of the Christian faith, Protestant and Catholic, which produced a century and a half of religious war. information revolutions produce political revolutions, and political revolutions often lead to violence, and we're in a very, very violent world. But again, seeing the historical patterns, I think, can help us, hopefully, to calm down, to get our bearings, because we all want to have a sense that our feet are planted, you know. We're not falling through space.
And so if we think about all this information coming at us, we have a lot of information, we still don't know what is true. Artificial intelligence helps us to still process through a lot of information, a lot more than is humanly possible, right? But they're black boxes for now, all these models, right? So how do we, these things you were mentioning, like fake news or manipulation of the public opinion through social media, well, not all of this is, with AI, is going to be on steroids, right? So how do we ensure we can tell what is true?
Well, Noelia, I'm glad you asked me easy questions. They're the best kind. I'm very interested to hear what you and the audience feel. This is the latest phase of this revolution. I sit on an advisory committee in Oxford on ethics in AI, and I have a strong feeling that all of us are chasing after a technological revolution, trying to understand, but we're behind. We're playing catch up with a revolution which is being, it's being written by coders in San Francisco, and they're already 10 steps ahead of us. And so we believe this technology must be regulated, because ChatGPT-4 and ChatGPT-3 were unleashed on a watching world with basically no controls at all. I'm glad to see that ChatGPT-4 was 100% accurate about me, but I know that it's doing what's called hallucinating. It's producing false results. And what's scary about the false results is that the computer scientists don't understand why it's generating false results. That is to say, this is a generative technology, a dynamic technology that is training itself on data as we speak every millisecond. And the people who put the parameters together of this, and we have to understand this is a technology with 500 billion parameters, right? So large that it escapes the capacity of any single computer scientist to understand all of its dynamics. And that then means that when we talk to them about the ethical dilemmas and the regulatory dilemmas, they say the real problem is we don't understand what this thing is doing. So that we suddenly have a thing that is upsetting to us. We've created something we don't fully understand. And we're back in something again that has historical antecedents, which are Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I mean, we've been thinking for 150 years about this nightmare. What happens if human beings make something that we no longer understand and are no longer able to control? So we've been in this imaginative space for actually 200 years, nearly, because she wrote it in 1819 or something. And so, again, we're going to have to sit down with the computer scientists. I sat down recently in Cambridge, Mass, with a wonderful woman at MIT. She had breast cancer. This is the positive side. She had breast cancer, and her breast cancer was picked up late. She survived, but she came out of it thinking, I want to devise an algorithm that predicts breast cancer before you have symptoms. Because had I had an algorithm diagnosing my breast cancer, my chances of survival would have been increased by a factor of 3. And because she's a great scientist, she then trained an algorithm on all the data about women and breast cancer, and has produced an algorithm which can predict, I don't know, 3-4 years out? I mean, just before there are any symptoms at all. She says the problem that the rest of us don't understand about regulation of AI is we actually need an algorithm to regulate the algorithm. That is, we need to have a standard government-instituted algorithmic test of the statistical reliability of the black box, its inference parameters. This is scientific technical stuff. We need to have an algorithm that checks whether the training data that went into the algorithm is adequate to the prediction it's making, to the data it's doing. You don't want to go to a treatment algorithm that predicts breast cancer if it hasn't been trained on breast cancer data, right? All of these are the dimensions that we have to get right. But as the computer scientists talk about this, I begin to get a sense that we can do this. We can do this. We'll be late, we'll make mistakes, but a dialogue between scientists, ethicists, philosophers, regulators, and politicians will get us there. And we don't need to invent the wheel. That would be what the historian would say. We've been regulating dangerous technologies for hundreds of years. So we just have to apply what we learned from regulation for those cases.
And so, I've heard that called constitutional AI, right? The algorithm that regulates the algorithms. But then who owns the constitutional AI? That would be another question.
But that's one of the analogies I would draw from my little story about Condorcet. Condorcet's hymn to progress could be interpreted as a desperate man in political trouble, hoping that science and technology would save him from politics, right? And the thing I come out of my AI discussions feeling is we need to bring politics back in. When you ask the question, excellent question, who owns the regulatory tools? There's only one answer. We the people. I mean, and so it's an enormous challenge, but an enormous opportunity for our democracies. We do not want to turn this over to Google. We do not want to turn it over, no offense to Amazon. We do not want to turn it over to private corporations. We have to turn it over to people who are accountable to the people in this room. And so it's a huge challenge for democracy, but
you feel it's a manageable one. You're optimistic.
I'd rather give this to a democracy than I give it to Xi Jinping, frankly.
Yeah, and there is, my feeling is that at least at this point, I'm on the technology side, right? So we've always been like, technology, progress, technology will create abundance and all problems will be solved and, markets will solve it. But what I feel is at least a lot of people now within the technology world are no longer that optimistic, right? They're cautious, they can see. So to me, that's a good sign to bring everybody on the table. Now, when it comes to regulation, as always, this is nothing new either. You always have to strike the balance. We've seen lots of regulation popping up in every continent now, right? Some is more forbidding, right?
Yep.
Then you have the standard self-regulation. How do you strike that balance to have innovation also with technology that is safe to allow, the cancer prediction while keeping the technology safe? When do we? Another easy question.
Yeah, this is getting tougher and tougher. And I do want to give you a government health warning. You are not looking at an AI expert, okay? Just understand, you're looking at a historian. There are things about history I do know, but I am not an AI expert. I am a well-meaning amateur, okay? This is truth in advertising, okay? It's always going to be a balance. And that is one of the things that democracy is good at. We get the entrepreneurs in, we get the scientists in, we get the bureaucrats in, we get the regulators in, we get the people, for example, who regulate airlines and airline safety. And we learn from them about how airline regulation and safety has made airlines as safe as they are. We learn from these places. The problem we have, I referred to Xi Jinping a minute ago, is this is a technology that has to be regulated globally. Because you can easily imagine a situation where Spain decided it's so scared of the potential of AI that it regulates the AI industry in Spain out of existence. So you've got to get an international discussion about AI regulation. And ultimately you have to bring in the Chinese, because if you over-regulate in the United States, the Chinese will exploit its, you know what this is called, it's called regulatory arbitrage. Mm-hmm. You know, you figure out where to locate where regulation is lightest, because that's where you can make most money. And you've got to avoid that problem. And one of the ways we might, now I'm about to scare you momentarily, but a very good computer scientist, one of the greatest ones, Geoffrey Hinton, resigned from Google last week, and you may have seen this in the newspapers. And he was asked, how do you get the Chinese to cooperate with you in AI regulation? And he said, as soon as the Chinese understand that we are on the cusp of creating a technology whose intelligence will be superior to our own, an intelligence that will quickly get beyond our control, we will have created a technology that threatens life on Earth. And once the Chinese understand that it threatens life on Earth, we will then have joint regulation, as we have of nuclear weapons. Mm-hmm. That is, there has to be a species threat, right? A threat that threatens all of us equally, and that creates the incentive you need to have minimal standards in authoritarian and democratic societies alike. So, yes, AI is potentially scary, but it's precisely its scariness that creates the possibility of international agreement to regulate.
And it's bringing us together at the table. That's good.
Yeah.
I'm more optimistic after this. Going back to my introduction created by ChatGPT with a prompt, and I've also read that you've been suspicious of some of your students maybe using these type of tools to write essays, right?
Yeah.
And I get it. I was in a demo last week that showed how one of these AI bots could create amazing presentations just with text. And I'm like, all the time I've wasted for the past 20 years, yes. Right? I mean, it's clear that we need to resign ourselves, and I'm now going back to your book, to the fact that, you know, this is coming and this can be an incredible tool, right? And you talk in your book about consolation versus resignation, and consolation being the opposite of resignation. To quote, you say that to be consoled is to make peace with the order of the world, which is AI is coming and these tools are coming, right? Without renouncing our hopes for future. And the essential element of consolation is hope. So where is, in a world where generative AI can write essays, write even novels, create visual works of art, write code, where is our hope for humans? What will be left for us to do?
Boy, again, it gets more and more difficult here. To give you a sense of, so you don't think I'm kind of idiotically optimistic, let me tell you this story about my students, because it's revealing of what the problem is. I had 32 students in my human rights and history class. 30 of them produced essays at the end of term. And this term, 2 of them produced an essay where I had a problem I've never had before, which is if you teach the way I teach and the way there may be teachers in the room who do the same, you begin to know how students sound. You begin to pick up their signature of how they speak and argue. And in 2 of these papers, I thought, this paper has not been written by this student because it just doesn't sound like the student at all, right? So in our university, we run all the papers through a software which checks for plagiarism, but the problem wasn't plagiarism because they'd footnoted every damn thing. There were like 60 footnotes. So it wasn't plagiarism. So what was it? Why was it that this language was slightly impersonal and sort of strange and weird? And I called the people in and I said, is it ChatGPT-4? And they said, no. But we don't have a technology that can check whether it's ChatGPT-4 yet. And so I had to take their words for it. And frankly, they have an incentive not to tell the truth, because if they are using ChatGPT-4 in our university, they fail the course. It's illegal. So, but they did confess that they were using software that enhances their English because they are second language speakers. And so you're suddenly in this queasy world in which you're not actually sure whether these students have authored this work. And I think that's the world we're going into big time. Authorship. Who is the author? Provenance. Provenance. Think about that word, provenance. Where does data come from? What is the source of the data? Provenance and authorship are suddenly in question in a way that I think are mostly new. And trust, ultimately. This is what's painful about this story to me as a teacher, is I love my students. And I don't like to be in a situation where I don't know whether they're writing their own stuff or not. It breaks a fundamental principle of the academic experience. And then if you extend that thought into politics, we are already in a world right now, and possibly in your elections this year, in which you will receive messages where you can't actually, and you will receive pictures where you can't actually tell whether these are real. The incentive to create false pictures of politicians in compromising situations or ridiculous situations, the incentive to put out messages that purport to be from one candidate but they're actually authored by another candidate, we're in a epistemological nightmare if we don't get this right. And so, because this is a direct threat to democracy, and it's a direct threat to universities and to teaching and to human trust, we simply have to regulate. And then you think about, okay, how have we regulated this problem in the past? Somebody pointed out to me that one of the regulatory successes we've had for 1,000 years is counterfeiting. You know, we've had to get really good at deciding whether money is real or fake. We have 1,000 years of experience with counterfeit money. And we're going to have to think about, use that metaphor to make sure that the money in politics, which is communication, is real money. And so I think we can use historical analogies to think about, okay, how did they figure out that someone's clipping the coinage? Because that's what's happening now. The coinage of politics is being clipped and falsified and faked. And the coinage of academic exchange between student and teacher is being clipped. And so I keep thinking, as long as we understand this problem and understand what's at stake, we can fix this. Because we don't in the world, in the end, in our personal relations, in our professional relations, in our business relations, want to live. We actually can't live in a world where we don't know the difference between reality and unreality. Yeah. It's just so primary, it's so existential. We have to fix the problem. We only fix the problems we have to fix, but this one we will fix.
Yeah, I did get an email Monday actually about some project at Stanford where they actually got very good results testing what they call detect ChatGPT. So I guess something similar to your. But the thing is, then yes, we are going to get to detect it, but then all of these requires a lot of resources because having the data, the computational power that you need to run this type of things, even the whatever you come up with to guardrail the models is going to require a lot of infrastructure and a lot of new tools, right? So who takes care of that and how? And then there is the more basic question of how do we, when it comes to education, right? How do we still ensure all these tools don't hinder our youth's development? I mean, they still need to do learn how to think critically, lots of things to deal with.
I think at this point you may be puzzled. I've been talking about artificial intelligence and ChatGPT and stuff about which I'm a complete amateur, and not talking about consolation. I actually think I am talking about it, because what I'm trying to talk about is, given these things that frighten us, and we have good reason to be frightened about some of the aspects of this, how do we find grounded reasons to hope that we can solve the problems? And ChatGPT is a kind of example of a much bigger problem, which is how do we regain enough confidence in ourselves to master a future which is entirely unknown and bound to be unexpected. But this problem, which is the historical dimensions of consolation, have been with us since the beginning of time. We're not the first people to face unknown technologies, frightening technologies. Imagine what happens when gunpowder first appears in Europe. Every sensible person looks at the gunpowder and thinks, oh my God, this is going to change the geostrategy of Europe. And it does. What they fear does happen. But they master this technology, get it under some kind of control after 300 or 400 years of warfare, and we survive and we go on. I'm talking about AI not because I'm an expert, but because I think it's such a paradigmatic case of the panic we have about the future and how important it is for us not to panic and use historical resources, use our knowledge, and work together to fix the problem.
I'm going to quote your book again. Now that you mention it, because there's a quote that I really liked. It says, when suffering becomes understood as an illness, with a cure, something is lost. And I don't know if we can qualify as suffering this perpetual anxiety we live in because we feel like we cannot keep up with all this information. I don't know if we can qualify as suffering the fact that our youth is having more mental problems and depression, arguably driven by social media. But let's say we call it suffering. What can we learn from this recent history of suffering that does what people in your book did, right? Use that suffering to come to greater heights and
what I was trying to say there in that thing you quoted was to contrast the 20th century technologies for the management of suffering, which are basically therapy, with these much older traditions which didn't see suffering as an illness from which you could recover or a condition for which you could have a medical treatment or a medication, but saw suffering in a completely different way as just the uneliminable essential feature of human life. And the paradox of that view is once you take suffering and accept it as something that is just bound to happen, you do a little less of why me? You do a little less of complaining about it. You take it as just part of the journey. And there's something very wise about some of these traditions that understood the necessity and inevitability of suffering. I don't want to get this wrong. I don't want to have anyone think I think it's a good thing. One of the best things about the Western tradition, going back right to the beginning, is a revolt against suffering, a desire to reduce suffering. We have the medicine we have because dedicated people wanted to reduce the amount of suffering, the needless suffering, the horrible suffering. But some of these older traditions had a great deal of wisdom about suffering and loss, and teach us not to medicalize it. And one of the people who led the medicalization of this, which is Sigmund Freud, also had another side of him which I've always admired. You probably know this quotation. He said, the goal of therapy is to convert hysterical misery into common unhappiness. This is a very, very wise remark. The goal of therapy is not a cure. It's not happy talk. It's taking uncontrollable suffering, suffering that's driving you mad, suffering that is making it impossible for you to function, and returning to a state in which you have to accept that you may just have to experience quite a lot of common unhappiness. And that's, I think, the wisest side of the therapeutic revolution. That is the side that admits there's just a lot we can't fix. There's just a lot we can't fix about life. And there's a lot about things like grief, for example. There's a very amusing moment. This will allow you to laugh at the Americans, and it's always funny to laugh at the Americans. I'm a Canadian, and we laugh at the Americans as a national sport. But the American Psychiatric Association had a serious discussion about whether grief, extended grief, should be described as a psychological disorder. And anybody who's lost someone knows that grief is not a psychological disorder. Grief is an essential process by which you come to terms with something really difficult. It's some of the most important experiences of your life, grief. And so to have these American shrinks suddenly say, can we put you on the couch and give you a pill to take this away, suddenly seems to misunderstand something pretty fundamental about human beings. Now, don't get me wrong, there are forms of grief which are pathological, where people get absolutely trapped in grief and can't escape. There might be limit cases like that where I think you should see a therapist. And I should also say I have been to a therapist at periods in my life when I had real difficulties. I don't want anybody to go out of here thinking I don't respect and admire a good therapist. But this tradition, this tradition of consolation, had a completely different orientation towards suffering and loss and pain. And I think there's wisdom there that we can use.
Mm-hmm. And they tell me we need to wrap up. But I know it felt very short. But wrapping up, just you and me. Now we're gonna open it up for the audience. Yes? That's why I put on my glasses.
Thank you, Professor. Andres Ortega, I'm I write about these things. You're a humanist. Mm-hmm. So do you think that technology, which I think is already changing us, our memory, in relation with our phones, which are not used to talk, but for other things, do you think that technology, not in the sense of AI, but also in the sense of genetic editing and all of this, is going to change us as humans? Or even, do we have to change as humans not to be overcome by technology? And I have another question, very simple, to talk about artificial intelligence. Yeah. What is intelligence?
What is intelligence? Well, you've just displayed it there. I think a historian's answer to your first question is that we have been in an interaction with technology since the very beginning of recorded time, and we've been constantly being changed by our technology. We were changed by, let me give you an odd example. When you listen to Beethoven and Mozart, you sometimes hear the thunder of horses. That is, his artistic imagination about syncopation and sound was deeply shaped by the technological world in which he lived, namely a world in which you heard horses clattering on cobblestones or thundering through the woods. And some of the fantastically exciting moments in Beethoven sound to me like a cavalry charge of horses across an open field. In other words, this is a great mind and a great artist reflecting on the oral culture of his technological world. And then if you switch into the 20th century, you see artists reflecting constantly on the soundscape of Madrid 1920 or Vienna 1920. So we're constantly affected and interacted with technology. And I don't think it's made us any less human. It just means we're very different human beings. So you could do a history of humanity in terms of its interaction with technology over time, and you tell a story that was both a story of how much we have been changed by the technology we used, how much our imagination has been changed by the technologies we used. But I think we'd also say we are also recognizably the same. I mean, one of the biggest themes of this book, if you ask me what consolation I am trying to spread or purvey or convey in this book, it's that we are never alone. We have this enormous, continuous, sustained human tradition. And we can recognize ourselves and our dilemmas and our experience in work written 2,000 years ago. We are not marooned in the present. Technology has not taken us over and rewired our brains or our instincts or thoughts at all. And in that sense, it's this double story. Technology, we've been interacting with technology for 10,000 years, but we can return to the beginning of the recorded human record and say, that's us. And that's the historical paradox that I find fascinating and also extremely inspiring, because it means that nothing is lost. There's no human experience that is alien to us, as the great Roman philosopher Terence said. There's no human experience that's alien to us because we're continuously linked to this tradition of human experience and human achievement. And so I have no fear that AI is going to rewire us. I just think we need to get AI under control. In the same way we've got every technology we've ever faced under control. and put it to human use. And in that sense, I'm definitely a humanist. I want humans in control of this.
Tenía la
Hi, I'm Esther Enriquez. First of all, I want to thank Fundación Telefónica and Aspen Insitute for providing us with this interesting discussion. I'm really delighted to hear you and your reflections about this topic, because when we were walking to here, my boyfriend asked me if I want to ask you a question, and I didn't really even think about it, because my week was really busy, so I didn't have time at all to reflectionate about this. But a thing that you have said triggered me to bring up to the table that thing that at Oxford conference a girl told you is not just her thought. It's a thought of a generation that has lost hope on the future. And I want to ask you, as a historian, if this has ever happened after, before, because I feel that our generation is not understood by our older people, and I don't know if we ever gonna restore this kind of hope, because climate change is here with us, and I don't know if our politicians have the answer to face it. Thank you.
It's a very good question as to whether there's a historical example of large numbers of young women and young men deciding that they didn't want to have children because they didn't have confidence in the future. I have an uneasy feeling that this is kind of new. Some of it, let's be clear, I want to be fair to this view, some of it is not despair, some of it is the only way we can get climate change under control is if we bring the birth rate down rapidly and very quickly. So in a way it expresses hope. If we all just stopped having children and the population collapsed, we might get through this in one piece. But I think that's also pretty apocalyptic, as we say. It's a little over-dramatic. And I think the one thing I worry about is when that young woman stood up, she stood up in a public place, as you have done, because she wanted to say something serious, which is the climate change crisis is really serious and something must be done. Fine, good, I hear it loud and clear. I respectfully don't think that's the solution, that's all. And the thing I don't want to have happen is to have a younger generation feel that they have to resort to more and more dramatic gestures in order to be heard. We need to move beyond that. We need to find some solutions that will work. And what I don't like is a discussion of climate change in which the only way you can be taken seriously on the climate change issue is if you say over and over again, we're doomed, we're finished, it's almost over. I just don't think that kind of apocalyptic talk is going to solve the problem. And then we have to listen to each other very, very carefully, because it is a hugely serious problem. But I keep seeing over and over, everywhere I look, a society slowly making the changes that have to be made. I think not in my lifetime, because I'm very old, but in your lifetime, we will be out of the fossil fuel era. We will be done with it. I can't land in the Vienna airport without seeing 500 huge windmills producing about 15% of Austrian baseload, which is where I live. I can't open the newspaper without seeing that in Norway, they will not sell gasoline-fueled cars after 2025. That's the day after tomorrow. If you look around, you see a lot of things happening. And I don't want to sound facile, but I do think this is where I have hope. I have hope that a lot of little things add up to something very, very, very big indeed. But then I'm a liberal, and I would say that, wouldn't I?
Good evening, my name is Aurora Mínguez. I just wanted to know whether artificial intelligence is neutral, whether we can speak of fascist artificial intelligence, a progressive, totalitarian, whether would it be possible one day a war of intelligence created by a man, and how could we prevent to be this intelligence manipulated by political interests? Thank you very much.
Let me build on that, because then we can get through more questions. So I'm Ollie Smith. Thank you for a great conversation, the two of you. It takes two to have a great conversation. I wanted to pick about values as well, and so this question of neutrality is fantastic. It's a fantastic setup. Thinking about global governance of AI, the global governance of technologies. Many technologies where we do have good global governance, the question is very technological. Think about nuclear weapons. You can see if there are centrifuges in Iran, where you can't see because they hide them, but that's more of a technological question. Whereas with artificial intelligence, I feel that a lot of it is really about values. What is fairness? What is truth? So in thinking about governing it internationally, do you think maybe it will draw us together, maybe not in a neutral space, but something that we can all agree with? Or will actually our differences in values in different places in the world actually place a ceiling or a barrier to that kind of global governance that you're calling for?
I guess I was hoping for a kind of easy night tonight. I was kind of thinking, we just stroll through this. Of course there can be a fascist AI. Of course there can be a totalitarian AI. The Chinese regime has absolutely perfected surveillance. And the next step of a total surveillance regime is an AI-enhanced surveillance regime. So we're very close to that. We're also discovering constantly with artificial intelligence systems that they are racially biased, sometimes biased against women. I mean, there are a whole bunch of things, and this brings up values to the degree that the people who write these algorithms are aware of this problem. They correct them. It is just emphatically not good business in the United States to have discriminatory AI that has facial recognition software that doesn't pick out Hispanic faces, or doesn't code right for black faces. I mean, and the reason that gets caught is the United States has had 65 years of a liberal revolution called civil rights and feminism, right? If you don't have that, the AI won't be trained properly. So yes, the values become the absolute decider. And one of the people that I work with in Oxford, this is a very unpleasant subject, has been fighting all her life at the digital and online abuse of children. AI opens up terrifying prospects for the abuse and the creation of products, imagined children, that can indulge and cultivate pedophile behavior. So we urgently need public debate about the values that we would use to regulate these technologies. But many of these value debates have occurred, thank God, and we think it's wrong in Spain or anywhere to discriminate in certain ways, by race, by sex, by gender, hopefully by class, by education, by physical appearance, by disability. And we want to protect children, and it's vital to protect children. But these are the value discussions we must have, because I think the implication of your question, which I entirely agree with, once we get the values straight, we can fix this. But we've got to be damn clear what those values are, the things we will not do with this technology, will not allow with this technology, right?
Thank you. We take the last one.
Hello. Sorry to all those people who couldn't ask questions. I know in your last everyone hates you, so I'll try to continue in that tradition. Thanks for the talk. I was going to ask a question about whether you would think that you'll be defined by your academic success or your political failure. But having heard the lady over there talk about how women aren't having children because of climate change, I'll just briefly add, I think the vast majority, even in Spain, more people want children they can have, and that's largely due to the fact that no one can afford to have children. It's very much a middle-class comfort blanket to talk about climate change, but one reason why people aren't having kids is money, and this does lead to my question. You know, you've said you're a liberal, obviously you didn't win in Canada, let's put it politely. You lost your own...
You don't have to be polite. I got clobbered.
Annihilated. Yeah, but I didn't want to say that, Michael. I didn't want to say you are historically the worst opposition leader of all time.
Thank you.
I didn't want to say that. I thought it was a bit rude, but thanks for saying it anyway. So my question for now really is, talking about liberalism, you mentioned your parents' generation. They did have hope, but they also had the opportunity to move forward, especially in Western societies, and improve their living standards. Whereas now, obviously, liberalism's benefits are not being shared by the overwhelming majority of people. And my real question for you now about liberalism is liberalism failing because it's created so few winners? Bluntly, are you losing because you deserve to lose?
I think that the fate of liberalism is a long story. I think there's no doubt that, well, let me back up. This is a very unequal society. You're saying this clearly. People can't have kids because there are economic pressures that are weighing down very heavily on the couple of generations following mine, no question. My generation grew up through what the French call the 30 glorious years, from 45 to 73. I didn't have to think about getting a job. I got a degree and I knew I would. It's a new world for your generation. What liberalism has to do with that is a long, complicated question. There's a thing called neoliberalism, which was deregulate the economy, deregulate the state, slash welfare, and don't care about inequality. That was never liberalism to me. I'm a social liberal. I'm passionate about individual freedom. That's why I'm a liberal. Liberty is value number one. But liberty without granite under all our feet, so that we've all got a chance, all got resources, is not a liberalism I recognize or support. And if you're saying to me that we failed to create the granite under the feet of the new generation, a sense of security and confidence that would allow them to have children, to create families, to create jobs, I think lots of political parties failed. But if you ask me to abandon liberalism, it seems to me the battle of 21st century politics, which I feel viscerally, is to rescue freedom from these damn neoconservatives who think what freedom is freedom from all regulation, from all social decency, and from all social protection. The liberty I understand and that I grew up with and benefited and made my entire life possible was a freedom that was dependent on public education, public health, public goods of all kinds. I'm a public good liberal. And to the degree that we've abandoned public goods and not invested enough, that's the challenge of the future. To create a world in which a young woman can feel confident that she can bring a child into the world. A young husband can feel confident to bring, because they know they're not going to fall through the grate. I mean, the purpose of a politics, the basic purpose of a politics is to take away fear. And if you're telling me there's a lot of fear in your generation, you're damn right. And all I know is that I was lucky enough to grow up in a world where I didn't know fear. And that was a perfectly specific political achievement of the post-war generation, my parents' generation. And if you feel that my generation let you down, then I take that very seriously. But don't abandon, don't make liberalism your enemy. That's not the issue. Neoliberalism, maybe. This conservatism, this new conservatism, particularly in the United States, which is at the edge of constitutional order. Those are the enemies that I think you have very good reason to fear. We need desperately, particularly getting back to the AI thing, we desperately need a democracy based on a shared world of common goods that we can trust and information that we can believe, and leaders who respond when we speak. We're not there, but I think we know that's what we need and where we want to go. And I did fail in politics, but ask me whether I'd do it again. Absolutely. Fail again, fail better, said Samuel Beckett. That's my motto.
Thank you very much. Sorry, we cannot take more questions, and I have to go catch a plane. Otherwise, I would continue if it was up to me. Exactly. Michael is going to be signing books at the entrance, so you can go ahead and talk to him there. And I have my book in my bag, but